A ruthless German billionaire demanded his maid play chess to prove a point about class superiority, unaware her 10-year-old daughter was a certified prodigy. "You, the cleaner, step forward," Leonhardt Hess's voice snapped across the silent penthouse in Manhattan. Nancy flinched as crystal glasses rattled on her tray. To the tyrannical real estate titan, she was just a ghost pushing a mop, but tonight she was his prop. He commanded her to sit at the onyx chessboard to show elite investors how the working class handled strategy. The wealthy guests chuckled, hungry for her humiliation. But then a small icy voice pierced the mockery. "My mother does not play your games, Mr. Hess, but I will." The laughter died instantly. Sadie, a 10-year-old girl in a faded dress, stepped out of the shadows and locked eyes with the oligarch. The heavy atmosphere froze as a child challenged one of New York's most powerful men. Just before we see how this little girl dismantles an empire, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a moment. The crystal chandelier above them cast long, sharp shadows across the onyx chessboard as the first pawn moved. Leonhardt pushed his white piece forward with a forceful snap of his wrist. He did not look at the board while making his opening moves because his eyes remained fixed on Nancy. He narrated his strategy to the wealthy onlookers while weaving cruel insults about the working class into his commentary. He sneered that strategy was an alien concept to people who spent their lives scrubbing floors for minimum wage. He claimed his aggressive kingside attack mirrored the way elite minds naturally dominated the weak. Sadie sat opposite him on a velvet cushion that was too large for her small frame. Her worn sneakers barely brushed the thick Persian rug, but her posture was rigid and unyielding. She ignored the venomous words directed at her mother and focused entirely on the 64 squares of the battlefield. The billionaire developed his knights and bishops rapidly to build a suffocating offensive line intended to crush her defenses within the first 10 minutes. Every time he captured a pawn, he tossed it onto the table and offered mocking advice about accepting inevitable losses. The elite guests drank their champagne while watching the spectacle with detached amusement. They expected the 10-year-old girl to cry or surrender under the immense psychological pressure. However, Sadie did not shed a single tear, nor did she show any sign of intimidation. Her blue eyes tracked every shift in power across the onyx surface, while her brain processed dozens of potential outcomes. Instead of panicking under Leonhardt's assault, she played a series of seemingly passive defensive moves. She retreated her knights and offered him empty spaces to occupy. Leonhardt eagerly took the bait and pushed his queen forward to deliver what he believed would be the final crushing blow. He leaned back in his leather chair and smirked at the crowd while raising his glass in a premature toast to his own superior intellect. That was the exact moment Sadie moved her hand. She did not play a defensive block, but slid her bishop across the board along an obscure diagonal path that completely bypassed his attacking pieces. The move sacrificed her own rook, but simultaneously cut off the escape route for the white king. Leonhardt choked on his champagne as his smug expression dissolved into genuine confusion. He stared at the board and suddenly realized his aggressive vanguard was out of position and his king was hopelessly trapped behind his own pawns. Before he could formulate a desperate countermeasure, Sadie picked up her remaining knight and placed it firmly on the final square. "Checkmate, Mr. Hess," she stated in a calm voice that cut through the absolute silence of the penthouse. The collective gasp from the surrounding executives felt like a physical blow to the billionaire. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as the realization of his humiliating defeat by a maid's daughter sank in. the calm and calculated facade of the real estate oligarch shattered completely. He roared in blind fury and slammed his heavy fists down onto the table. The expensive onyx pieces flew across the room and shattered against the marble floor. He leaped from his chair and pointed a shaking finger directly at the child's face. He screamed that it was impossible for a street rat to outsmart him and loudly accused both Sadie and Nancy of using earpieces to cheat. His voice cracked with hysterical rage as he transformed from a sophisticated titan into a wild beast backed into a corner. The morning after the disaster at the penthouse, a cold reality settled over Nancy's cramped basement apartment. A sharp knock on the peeling wooden door shattered the quiet dawn. Two men in tailored suits stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The lead attorney handed Nancy a thick manila envelope containing a preliminary eviction notice and a fabricated lawsuit for extensive property damage and breach of contract. He delivered the tyrant's ultimatum with a mechanical lack of empathy. Sadie must agree to a highly publicized rematch at the New York Public Library by the end of the week. If the child refused, the corporation would immediately terminate Nancy's employment, seize their meager belongings, and bury them under millions of dollars in fraudulent legal debt. The lawyer did not raise his voice, but his quiet tone carried the crushing weight of a billionaire's unlimited resources. Nancy pulled her daughter close as the men pivoted and marched back out into the dreary morning rain. Barely 10 minutes passed before another hesitant tap echoed from the hallway. Nancy opened the door, expecting the attorneys to have returned with more threats. Instead, a frail 72-year-old man stood dripping in the doorway, holding a battered briefcase against his chest. He introduced himself as Bernard, the former chief accountant for the corporate empire. He stepped out of the cold corridor and cast a nervous glance out the window before pulling the curtains shut. Bernard explained that he had attended the gala the previous night, standing deep in the shadows. He had witnessed the young girl completely dismantle the oligarch's strategy. That display of pure intellectual courage inspired him to finally step forward after years of living in silent terror. Bernard opened his briefcase and laid a stack of faded blueprints on the small kitchen table. He revealed that the billionaire did not merely evict poor families or underpay his staff to amass his vast fortune. The real estate titan had systematically drained the pension funds of thousands of elderly factory workers over the past decade. Nancy gasped while covering her mouth with trembling hands. She knew Sadie's late grandfather had died penniless after his manufacturing plant was acquired and dissolved by the exact same ruthless conglomerate. Bernard confirmed her worst fears by stating the grandfather's name was indeed on the stolen funds list. The old accountant leaned closer and lowered his voice to a strained whisper. He disclosed the existence of a red leather-bound ledger. This specific physical book contained the original, unedited financial records and handwritten signatures that could send the arrogant executive to a federal prison facility for the rest of his natural life. The ledger was currently locked inside a high-security vault situated on the top floor of the corporate tower. Digital copies had been wiped clean, leaving only this single physical proof of the massive economic crime. The stakes instantly transformed from a simple battle of pride into a desperate fight for survival and ultimate justice. The upcoming rematch was no longer just a cruel public execution designed to feed an oversized corporate ego. It presented a rare structural vulnerability in the security of the heavily guarded fortress. The tournament would force the tycoon to leave his sanctuary and focus entirely on the chessboard. Bernard looked directly into the sharp blue eyes of the 10-year-old Prodigy. He did not speak to her like a child, but addressed her as the only strategic mind capable of executing a distraction large enough to blind the city's most powerful man. Sadie stared back at the old accountant with unwavering focus. The tiny basement room felt suddenly charged with dangerous electricity as the absolute magnitude of the conspiracy settled over them. The stolen legacy of thousands of forgotten factory workers now hinged entirely on the small shoulders of a maid's daughter. Rain lashed against the cracked window of their kitchen as Bernard unrolled the blueprints of the Hess corporate tower. The faded architectural schematics smelled faintly of damp paper and old tobacco. He pointed a trembling finger at a specific rectangular room on the 82nd floor, marking the billionaire's private sanctuary. Bernard explained that the real estate tyrant was deeply paranoid and never left his vault unattended during standard business hours. The man employed a private security firm composed entirely of former military contractors who guarded the top levels with absolute precision. However, the upcoming highly publicized chess tournament presented a catastrophic flaw in that impenetrable defense. The arrogant executive viewed the match as a supreme media event designed to restore his shattered public image. He would undoubtedly bring his entire personal security detail to the New York Public Library to intimidate his opponents and manage the massive crowds. That unprecedented movement would leave the corporate tower operating on a minimal skeleton crew for a brief window of time. Bernard smoothed out a crease in the blue paper and outlined the most dangerous aspect of his infiltration plan. He possessed a master access code from his time as the chief accountant, but the vault's secondary biometric locks required a manual system override that would take exactly 60 minutes to bypass. He looked directly at the 10-year-old girl sitting across the table. The success of the entire operation rested entirely on her ability to manipulate time. Sadie could not simply defeat the oligarch quickly, as she had done in the penthouse. If the match ended in 10 minutes, the tyrant would immediately return to his office and catch Bernard in the act of stealing the red leather ledger. The child had to orchestrate a grueling psychological war of attrition. She needed to deliberately play a weak, defensive game designed to frustrate her opponent while simultaneously giving him false hope. She had to trap him in a complex web of slow maneuvers, forcing him to overthink every single pawn push. She must endure his inevitable verbal abuse and maintain absolute stoicism under the glaring lights of the media cameras without breaking character. The burden was astronomical because one wrong move could either lose the game prematurely or provoke the billionaire into walking away. Nancy slammed her hands down onto the blueprints and fiercely shook her head. Her maternal instincts flared into pure panic at the thought of placing her only child in the center of a high-stakes corporate heist. She argued that the billionaire was a dangerous predator who would completely destroy their lives if he discovered the deception. She vividly remembered the cold emptiness in the penthouse and knew the man lacked any moral boundaries. The mother pleaded with the old accountant to find another way or to go to the police with the information they already had. Bernard softly reminded her that law enforcement could do nothing without the physical ledger, and any premature accusations would just result in the evidence being incinerated. The small kitchen fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the storm outside. Sadie reached across the table and placed her small hand over her mother's shaking fingers. The young prodigy did not exhibit any fear regarding the overwhelming task ahead. She spoke in a quiet, steady voice, recalling the memories of her grandfather teaching her how to play on a scratched wooden board before the financial ruin broke his spirit. She recognized that the tyrant viewed chess purely as an instrument of cruelty to humiliate the vulnerable working class. Sadie calmly stated that she would use his own immense arrogance as a weapon against him. She promised to chain him to that table in front of the entire city until the stolen legacy of those forgotten workers was safely secured. Nancy looked deep into her daughter's determined blue eyes and slowly released a breath she felt she had been holding for years. The mother finally nodded her reluctant agreement, binding the three of them into a desperate pact forged in the shadows. Flashbulbs exploded like a lightning storm as Leonhardt Hess strode up the marble steps of the New York Public Library. The majestic rose-main reading room had been transformed into a gladiator arena for the corporate elite and the hungry media. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, imposing light over the central mahogany table, where a pristine tournament standard chessboard awaited the combatants. Hundreds of reporters, wealthy investors, and curious onlookers packed the grand hall to its absolute capacity, creating a suffocating atmosphere, thick with anticipation and nervous energy. The sheer scale of the historic venue, with its towering ceilings and massive arched windows, was specifically designed to overwhelm and intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the established hierarchy of wealth. The billionaire bathed in the adulation of the crowd, while waving confidently to the television cameras broadcasting the event live across the nation. He wore a custom-tailored suit that projected absolute power and unyielding dominance. Barely 5 minutes later, a heavy silence rippled through the massive room as Nancy and her 10-year-old daughter entered through a side door. Sadie walked toward the grand stage with her head held high despite wearing the same simple faded dress from the previous night. Before the child could even reach her designated chair, the real estate tycoon raised his hand to halt the proceedings. He flashed a predatory smile toward the press pool and loudly announced that the integrity of the game must be preserved against any potential street-level trickery. Two imposing men from his private security detail immediately stepped forward, blocking the young girl's path to the table. They produced handheld metal detectors and began conducting a thorough and highly invasive search of the small child. The security personnel swept the electronic wands over her arms, legs, and the collar of her worn dress, while the camera zoomed in to capture every second of the degrading spectacle. Nancy stood just a few feet away behind a velvet rope, with her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. But she forced herself to remain completely silent to protect the mission. The cruel display was a calculated psychological strike, meant to break the Prodigy's spirit before a single pawn was even moved. Sadie endured the humiliating search with chilling stoicism, staring straight ahead without offering the tyrant the satisfaction of a single tear or a fearful flinch. Once the head arbiter finally cleared the child and started the official clock, the billionaire wasted absolutely no time. Leonhardt launched his opening attack with a terrifying and brutal speed intended to completely crush his tiny opponent within the first dozen moves. He grabbed his white pieces and slammed them down onto the wooden squares with aggressive force, creating sharp echoing cracks that reverberated throughout the silent library. His strategy relied on overwhelming intimidation and sheer momentum rather than elegant tactical planning. He wanted a public execution, not a thoughtful intellectual debate. He stared directly into the little girl's eyes, after every rapid move silently daring her to crumble under his relentless pressure. Everyone in the grand hall leaned forward, expecting the brilliant Maid's daughter to unleash the same devastating counterattack she had demonstrated at the penthouse. However, Sadie did exactly the opposite. She firmly clamped down on her natural instinct to fight back and executed her secret mission to manipulate time. The young prodigy began playing the most pathetic and passive defensive lines imaginable. She timidly retreated her knights to their starting positions and cautiously moved her pawns forward, only one square at a time, to build a cramped, cowardly fortress. She deliberately offered up minor pieces without asking for any strategic compensation. A collective groan of extreme disappointment quickly washed over the massive audience. The spectators had tuned in to watch an underdog triumph, but instead they were witnessing a complete massacre. The whispers rapidly escalated into loud murmurs of disapproval and open mockery from the elite sections. Leonhardt leaned back in his luxurious chair and let out a booming laugh that cut through the tension. He loudly mocked her cowardly maneuvers and sarcastically asked if she had already exhausted her limited working-class intellect. The psychological weight in the room became unimaginably heavy as thousands of angry, disappointed eyes stared down at the 10-year-old girl. Sadie sat completely isolated in the hostile arena, bearing the suffocating burden of the crowd's rising contempt while keeping her trembling hands locked together in her lap to hide her internal struggle. 50 minutes into the game, the grand reading room felt completely devoid of oxygen. The digital clock ticking down beside the wooden board became the loudest sound in the massive library, echoing like a judge's gavel with every passing second. Leonhardt did not just play the game, but actively sought to fundamentally break the young girl's mind. He leaned his large frame across the mahogany table and continuously whispered venomous taunts designed to completely shatter her remaining confidence. He ridiculed her worn clothing and confidently predicted that her mother would be scrubbing his corporate toilets for the rest of her miserable life. The billionaire demanded she resign immediately to save them both from further public embarrassment and to accept her natural place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Cold sweat beaded heavily along Sadie's pale forehead and slowly dripped down her temples, soaking into the collar of her faded dress. Her vision blurred slightly from the immense mental strain of calculating dozens of defensive variations, while simultaneously enduring his relentless verbal abuse. The blistering heat from the television studio lights, mounted above the tournament table, baked the air, making every breath feel heavy and exhausting. Despite the agonizing physical and mental pressure, she absolutely refused to break her stoic facade. She stared fiercely at the board, except for brief, highly calculated moments when she looked away. Every few minutes, her icy blue eyes flicked upward, past the aggressive billionaire, toward the massive heavy oak entrance doors located at the far end of the grand hall. She mentally counted every agonizing second, hoping against hope to see the brass handles finally turn. Bernard needed exactly 60 minutes to manually bypass the biometric security vault at the corporate tower, and she was desperately trying to buy him those final precious moments through sheer stubbornness. The young prodigy possessed a brilliant and naturally aggressive offensive mind, but she forcefully suppressed every natural instinct she had to counterattack. Instead, she displayed an almost supernatural level of endurance. Sadie systematically sacrificed her remaining knights and bishops just to build temporary barricades against the overwhelming white army marching across the onyx squares. Whenever Leonhardt violently smashed through one line of defense, she immediately constructed another, using a handful of seemingly insignificant pawns. She intentionally played ugly, uninspired moves that further infuriated the wealthy spectators, who loudly demanded a swift and brutal conclusion to the match. The elite crowd grew increasingly hostile and restless, completely unaware they were witnessing an absolute masterclass in psychological survival rather than a simple intellectual defeat. Every single minor piece she surrendered bought another 2 or 3 agonizing minutes for the old accountant working miles away in the dark. She was slowly and intentionally bleeding her own forces dry just to keep the game and their secret mission alive. The real estate oligarch grew visibly enraged by her stubborn refusal to simply die on the board and accept her inevitable loss. He hated how her weak pieces constantly scurried away and found tiny pockets of safety just before his fatal strikes could land. His face turned a dark shade of crimson as he realized the 10-year-old child was somehow dragging him into a deep, grueling war of attrition. Deciding to end the humiliating spectacle once and for all, Leonhardt grabbed his heavy white rook with thick, trembling fingers. He slid the powerful piece aggressively across the polished wood and slammed it deep into the corner of her defensive zone with a resounding crack. The devastating maneuver effectively paralyzed her remaining forces and completely cut off the Black King's only possible escape route along the back rank. He crossed his arms over his custom-tailored suit and sneered directly at the exhausted child sitting opposite him. The digital timer ticked down to the final 3 minutes, indicating the absolute limit of her resistance. The chessboard was completely suffocated, leaving no legal moves that would not result in an immediate checkmate. Sadie stared down at her trapped king while casting one final desperate glance toward the back of the hall. The heavy oak doors remained stubbornly shut, locking her inside in a failing battle. She had completely run out of pieces to sacrifice, and time had finally expired. Sadie did not look at the board. Her icy blue eyes were fixed on the heavy brass handles of the entrance doors. The sudden sharp screech of heavy metal hinges echoing across the silent library made everyone jump in their seats. The massive wooden panels swung violently open, revealing the frail figure of Bernard standing proudly alongside 4 heavily armed uniformed federal agents. The old accountant gasped for air after rushing up the steep marble steps, but his wrinkled hands maintained a death grip on the critical red leather-bound ledger. The moment the child spotted the physical evidence secured by the authorities, a profound transformation washed over her posture, completely altering the heavy atmosphere around the tournament table. The exhausted and frightened little girl instantly vanished, leaving behind a calculating apex predator who had successfully lured her greedy prey into a fatal trap. She slowly turned her attention back to the 64 squares and finally released the suffocating defensive charade she had maintained for an agonizing hour. Leonhardt stared at the sudden commotion near the entrance with a deep scowl, entirely unaware that the real danger rested directly beneath his fingertips. Sadie reached out and firmly grasped her black queen, sliding the most powerful piece on the board into a highly vulnerable position, right next to the white king. The billionaire snapped his head around and scoffed loudly at what he perceived as a final desperate blunder caused by extreme mental fatigue. He eagerly snatched the queen from the board, believing he had officially secured his ultimate public triumph over the working class. That single greedy action instantly triggered a cascading structural collapse across his entire offensive line. The arrogant executive had pushed his forces so far forward during his relentless assault that he had completely abandoned his own back rank, leaving his king terribly exposed. Sadie immediately capitalized on the gaping structural vulnerability by deploying her hidden bishop across an obscure diagonal path that sliced through the center of the board. Leonhardt froze as the color rapidly drained from his face, realizing the sacrificed queen was merely a brilliant decoy designed to pull his primary defender completely out of position. He desperately reached for his knights to block the incoming threat, but quickly discovered they were hopelessly pinned behind his own poorly positioned pawns. His hands trembled violently as his panicked eyes darted across the board, searching for a miraculous escape route that simply did not exist. Sadie executed her third and final consecutive maneuver by sliding a humble pawn forward to deliver the lethal strike. "Checkmate, Mr. Hess," she declared with a cold precision that utterly shattered his grand delusion of invincibility. He stared at the wooden pieces with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to comprehend the absolute destruction of his empire. The stunned silence in the grand reading room was immediately broken by the heavy thudding footsteps of the federal agents marching swiftly down the center aisle. The uniformed officers forcefully pushed past the bewildered reporters and elite spectators to reach the main stage. The lead investigator stepped directly onto the raised mahogany podium, holding up a federal arrest warrant detailing extensive pension fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. The officer loudly ordered the real estate oligarch to stand up and place his hands behind his back while reciting his legal rights directly into the hot television microphones. The elite crowd erupted into a chaotic frenzy of flashing cameras and shocked gasps as the dark truth finally spilled out into the open. The wealthy investors who had previously cheered for his ruthless tactics now frantically backed away, trying to distance themselves from the disgraced criminal. The tyrannical billionaire, who had spent his entire life orchestrating the suffering of vulnerable families, found himself completely paralyzed. He was utterly destroyed not by a rival corporation, but by the brilliant mind of a 10-year-old prodigy and the undeniable truth contained within a single, battered book. The mighty empire of Leonhardt Hess collapsed not with a roar, but with the quiet, definitive click of handcuffs. The subsequent media shockwave completely obliterated the disgraced executive's carefully constructed public image within mere hours. Major television networks relentlessly broadcasted the irrefutable evidence extracted directly from Bernard's secured ledger, exposing the massive financial conspiracy to the entire world. Federal prosecutors swiftly liquidated the tyrant's extensive corporate real estate portfolio to successfully restore millions of stolen dollars back into the devastated retirement accounts. Thousands of elderly factory workers, including the surviving friends of Sadie's late grandfather, finally received their rightful financial compensation alongside long overdue justice. Leonhardt stood trial and quickly received multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary, permanently stripped of his vast wealth and fake honor. Having secured their future through a generous whistleblower reward, Nancy permanently retired her cleaning supplies and moved her family out of that damp underground apartment forever. Supported by widespread community gratitude, the mother and daughter proudly opened a free neighborhood chess academy specifically dedicated to underprivileged youth. The welcoming sanctuary provided vulnerable children with a bright, safe environment to sharpen their analytical skills. Standing beside a polished wooden board, Sadie offered a profound final reflection on their historic battle against the cruel billionaire. She softly explained to her new students that true strength never comes from hoarding money or shouting cruel insults at those who appear defenseless. The brilliant prodigy smiled warmly and firmly stated that quiet patience, combined with undeniable truth, will constantly remain the absolute greatest checkmate against any form of blind tyrannical arrogance.